John had always been a quiet man, someone who preferred the solitude of his own thoughts over the company of others. His home was a tall, multi-story house with enough creaks and groans to remind him that it had been there long before him. Perched on a hill, his home was uncomfortably close to its neighboring building, an apartment complex that seemed to loom just a few feet away. The proximity was such that John could easily see into the windows of the apartments, observing his neighbors as they went about their daily lives. It wasn't something he had planned, but once he noticed the view, it became an unintentional habit. At first it was mundane. He would glance over occasionally, catching glimpses of a man reading a book, a woman folding laundry, a family sharing dinner. Each window offered a different scene, and in some strange way, it provided John with a sense of company without the obligation of interaction. He was alone, but he wasn't lonely. As the days grew shorter and the winter set in, the world outside felt colder, darker. Snow began to blanket the ground, and with fewer people outside, John found himself peering through the neighboring windows more often. He became familiar with the people in the apartments, though he had never spoken to any of them. One evening, as the wind howled against the windows, and the house seemed to shiver from the cold, John noticed something strange. 2 floors up, in the apartment directly across from his, a woman was standing by her window, her eyes wide, face pale as she nervously tapped on the glass. It wasn't a casual gesture. Her hands trembled, and her fingers beat a frantic rhythm as if she was desperately trying to get someone's attention. John leaned closer, his breath fogging up the cold glass of his own window. He could swear she was screaming, though he couldn't hear a sound. His heart pounded. Was she in danger? Was someone in there with her? He reached for his phone and dialed the police, his fingers shaking with the urgency of the moment. "There's a woman in the apartment across from mine," he told the dispatcher. "She's tapping on the window, like she's calling for help. You need to send someone quickly." Within minutes, the police arrived. John watched from his window as 2 officers approached the apartment building and went inside. His pulse quickened as he imagined the chaos unfolding behind the walls. Surely they would find her, find out what was wrong. A short while later, the officers emerged, their faces calm, their demeanor casual. John couldn't believe it. He rushed downstairs, throwing on his coat and slipping outside to meet them as they stepped out of the building. "I'm the one who called," he said, breathless from the cold and his own fear. "What happened? Did you find her?" The officers exchanged a glance. One of them spoke up. "Sir, we checked the apartment you mentioned. It's locked up tight. No one's been in there for a long time." John felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean?" "I just saw her. She was right there, tapping on the window." The officer frowned, clearly unimpressed. "That apartment has been abandoned for months. No utilities, no lights. It's empty." "But I saw her," John protested. "She was—" "Maybe you saw a reflection or something," the other officer said, his tone dismissive. "Cold nights like these can play tricks on you, but there's no one in there, trust me." John wanted to argue, but he could see it was useless. They didn't believe him. As the officers drove away, John stood in the snow, staring up at the window where he had seen the woman. The apartment was dark now, and no movement came from within. But he had been sure. He had seen her. Shaking his head, John trudged back inside, trying to convince himself it had been his imagination. Maybe the cold was getting to him. He tried to push the incident from his mind, but the following night he couldn't help but look again. At first the apartment was empty, just a dark, silent void framed by the frosted window pane. He almost sighed in relief. Perhaps it really had been nothing. Then, as if in slow motion, a figure stepped into view. John's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the woman this time. It was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, standing still as stone, staring directly at him. John blinked, unsure of what he was seeing. Why hadn't the police found him? Unsure of what to do, and trying to shake off his fear, John raised his hand and waved. It was a half-hearted gesture, more a nervous habit than anything else. The man waved back. John's skin prickled with unease. His heart thudded in his chest, but he couldn't look away. The man stood there, his arm slowly lowering after the wave, eyes still locked on John. Then, as if emerging from the shadows, the woman appeared beside him, her face as pale and terrified as the first time John had seen her. She too was staring at him, unmoving, unblinking. Something about the way they looked at him, like they were expecting something, unnerved John. He stepped back from his window, drawing the curtains in one swift motion. His hands were shaking. He couldn't get the image of their faces out of his mind, the way they had waved back as though they had been waiting for him to do it. The next day, John tried to put it out of his mind, telling himself it was all just a strange coincidence, but his thoughts kept circling back to that apartment, to the eerie calm of the man and the terror etched on the woman's face. Unable to shake the unease, John began asking around. He started with the few neighbors he knew in passing. Most of them shrugged off his questions about the apartment across the way. But one elderly woman, Mrs. Greer, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, gave him a knowing look. "That place has been empty for years," she said in a low voice, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "No one's lived there since the family, well, since they died." John felt a chill run down his spine. "Died?" Mrs. Greer nodded gravely. "It was a tragedy. A husband and wife. The woman, she, took her own life after her husband died in an accident. People say you can still see them sometimes, but no one's lived there since." John's heart sank as her words settled over him. He didn't want to believe it. Ghosts? Spirits? He wasn't the kind of person to believe in such things. And yet, what he had seen, the way they had waved back at him, it all felt too real to dismiss. For the next few days, John avoided looking out of his window at all costs. He focused on work, trying to convince himself that the police had been right, that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But late at night, when the wind howled and the house groaned around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He started hearing things, soft taps on his own windows, faint whispers in the silence. Then one evening, he couldn't help himself. He glanced out of the window again, just for a moment, just to see if they were still there. They were. This time, both the man and the woman were standing at the window, staring directly at him. And they were closer, pressed against the glass as if they wanted to come through. John stumbled back, his heart racing, fear crawling up his spine like icy fingers. He pulled the curtains closed and bolted from the room. He needed to get out of there, to escape whatever this was. Within weeks, John packed up and moved to another city, taking a new job far away from the haunting windows of his old house.